Paul Walker's collection. These people are going to come out in droves to come look at these cars.
Since we made the announcement during our Las Vegas auction, it's been overwhelming the amount of press that want to come out and see the cars. We would open it up and let people come out.
Paul Walker's death was genuinely one of the most heartbreaking moments in Hollywood history. To millions, it was the sudden end of a life that seemed as genuine off-screen as it was unforgettable on-screen. But as the months turned into years, strange details began to emerge, details that few people were paying attention to at the time. What was discovered after Paul Walker's death that caught so many people off guard? And why are some of the biggest questions surrounding his legacy still unanswered more than a decade later? Join us as we unveil what they found in Paul Walker's garage after his death. The tragic 5-minute drive. November 30th, 2013, is a date Fast and Furious fans can't forget in a hurry. Paul Walker spent that day the way he spent most weekends, surrounded by cars and people who needed his help. That Saturday, he had planned to take his mother and his teenage daughter, Meadow, to buy a Christmas tree. But before they left, he got a call from his charity, Reach Out Worldwide, informing him of a fundraiser they were hosting in Santa Clarita for survivors of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. Paul went. He always honored things like that. The event was held at Always Evolving, a car shop owned by Paul and his business partner, Roger Rodas. After spending the afternoon with fans, Paul and Roger decided to take Roger's newly acquired 2005 Porsche Carrera GT out for a short spin on a stretch of road they both knew well. Unfortunately, they didn't get far. The Porsche was traveling somewhere between 80 and 94 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone when Roger suddenly lost control on a curve. The car struck a light pole and several trees split apart and caught fire almost instantly. Both men were trapped in the car, and they died at the scene. Paul was 40 years old at the time. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the California Highway Patrol immediately launched an official investigation. They ruled out drugs, alcohol, and mechanical failure, and concluded excessive speed was the cause. The tires were nearly a decade old, but that detail would resurface later and matter more than anyone realized at the time. As expected, the public immediately reacted. Within hours, Vin Diesel, Paul's co-star and closest friend on the Fast and Furious set, posted an emotional tribute. Universal halted production on the 7th film in the franchise indefinitely. Fans built a memorial at the crash site so large that city workers eventually asked people to stop adding to it. While the world mourned, something very troubling was already unfolding roughly 10 miles away. Inside a warehouse most fans didn't even know existed. The warehouse betrayal. By every account from people who knew him, Paul Walker was a serious car collector. Sure, there are many celebrities with a garage full of gifted vehicles, but Paul was someone who actually studied automotive history and bought accordingly. He kept the bulk of that collection, more than 30 vehicles at times, in a private warehouse in Valencia. Richard Taylor was one of the people who helped Paul maintain it. The man had worked around the actors' cars long enough to know the inventory, the layout, and exactly what was worth taking. Less than 24 hours after Paul's death, Richard moved more than 30 cars out of that warehouse. He then refused to disclose where the vehicles had gone, a detail that formed the basis of an accusation that Richard was attempting to extort money from a family that hadn't yet buried their son. A lawsuit was later filed by Paul Walker's estate in 2015, after nearly 2 years, and it took roughly another year after that for the case to reach a resolution. The Los Angeles Superior Court dismissed the case after what Paul's family attorneys described as an amicable settlement was reached, one condition of which was that the family would be getting things back. The full terms were never disclosed, Fans don't know whether every vehicle came back in the condition it left in, or whether any had changed hands during the 2+ years they were missing. The original complaint itself raised the possibility that some cars may have already been sold before the family ever got them back. Some of the vehicles involved, according to court filings, were a 2011 Porsche 911 GT3 RS, a 2008 BMW M3, a 2006 Ford Crown Victoria, and several E30 generation M3s, cars that, notably, only scratched the surface of what Walker actually owned. The full scope of his collection wasn't fully visible to the public until years later, when a much larger portion of it went to auction under very different and far more carefully managed circumstances. But the warehouse dispute wasn't the only fight Paul's family would spend years working through. While the estate was still untangling what had walked out of that Valencia building, a much larger case was just getting started. The case that took 4 years to close. Paul's daughter, Meadow Walker, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Porsche. Her attorneys alleged that the 2005 Carrera GT had a history of instability and control issues, and that a defective seatbelt design contributed to her father being unable to get free of the car after impact. Many people would just dismiss this as the ramblings of a grieving daughter, but it was more than that. This was a serious, technical case, built around vehicle dynamics. Although Porsche didn't settle quickly, it didn't concede much either. The company filed its own claim, arguing that Paul had knowingly and voluntarily assumed all risks associated with getting into that car, and that the vehicle had been altered and misused in ways that contributed to the crash. Porsche also pointed to the fact that the official investigation had already ruled speed as the cause of the crash. Porsche argued that the Carrera GT's design was sound for its era. But what exactly Porsche meant by altered, and whether that claim was ever substantiated in any real detail, never became public. In 2016, Meadow was awarded $10.1 million from Roger Rodas' estate. Her lawyer, Jeff Milam, said publicly at the time that the amount only covered a fraction of what her father would have earned as an international movie star if his life had not been tragically cut short. That fight with Porsche finally ended on October 16, 2017, just under 4 years after the crash. Both sides asked for the case to be dismissed, and a settlement was reached. The terms were confidential then, and remain confidential even now. While the legal battle ended in silence, what surfaced next spoke volumes. A collection nobody expected. For most of the world, Paul Walker was Brian O'Connor, and his relationship with cars began and ended with Fast and Furious, Nissan Skylines, Toyota Supras, and the whole street racing aesthetic the franchise built its identity around. However, auction records eventually showed something totally unexpected, a collection that had almost nothing to do with that on-screen image. The news started spreading in October 2019 that a significant portion of Paul's personal car collection, consigned by a close friend who had helped manage it since his death, would cross the block at Barrett-Jackson's Scottsdale auction in January 2020. 21 vehicles in total, consisting of cars, trucks, and motorcycles spanning 5 decades. There were 5 white BMW M, 3 lightweight editions, a factory model built in a production run of only 126 units worldwide. The cars were effectively homologation race cars for the street. This was an edition that serious collectors can spend years trying to locate a single one. But Paul had 5, all housed in the same building. According to Barrett-Jackson chairman Craig Jackson, the late actor had bought most of them back in the early 2000s, some years before other collectors even fully understood what E36 lightweights actually were. Craig described him as a pioneer buying ahead of a market that hadn't caught up yet. The best of the five was a 1995 model with just 4,600 miles on it. It was sold for $385,000, shattering the previous auction record for the model by more than double. The remaining four brought in prices between $220,000 and $258,500 apiece. Together, the five lightweights alone pulled in over $1.2 million. The rest of the collection told an even broader story. There was a 1989 Nissan Skyline R32 with a twin-turbocharged inline-six, the car most associated with his on-screen persona, which sold for a modest $100,100. A customized 2009 Nissan 370Z that had appeared on screen in Fast 5 brought in $105,600. There was also a 2013 Ford Mustang Boss 302S that Walker had reportedly never even driven. The car was gifted to him and placed straight into storage. It was sold at the auction for $95,700. There was a 1965 Shelby Cobra 427 that sold for $352,000. A 1969 Chevrolet Camaro RSZ28 Survivor model that fetched $220,000. A 1995 Ford Bronco with only 30,000 miles. Motorcycles, trucks. Then there was a 1967 Chevrolet Nova, which went for $60,500. Craig Jackson compared Paul to a modern-day Steve McQueen, someone who lived his passion for racing rather than simply playing it for a camera. He noted that when Paul purchased the five lightweights, people close to him believed he saw them as investment vehicles, and that there was speculation about whether he'd been quietly building toward assembling his own racing team. Every dollar from the sale, more than $2.33 million combined, went directly to a trust for Meadow Walker, who used the proceeds to fund the Paul Walker Foundation's marine science grants and scholarships. And according to Craig Jackson, that 21-car lot wasn't the whole story either. Meadow, he said, had already kept a handful of cars from the collection that meant something to her personally before the rest went to auction. He never named them, and he's never elaborated since, which means the full picture of what Paul Walker had assembled across his lifetime was never fully visible to anyone outside the family. It turns out, however, that the cars weren't the only part of Paul Walker's life the public had badly misjudged. The marine biologist behind Brian O'Connor. Long before Paul Walker became Brian O'Connor, he was a student of marine biology, and at first, the only reason he took up acting jobs was to pay off his student loans. He planned to go back and finish his degree right after. He never did. But by his own account in interviews, the passion never actually left him. In 2006, he joined the board of directors of the Billfish Foundation, an organization focused on ocean and fish population health. 4 years later, he spent 11 days on a research vessel off the coast of Mexico for National Geographic's Expedition Great White, helping a scientific crew catch, tag, and collect DNA samples from great white sharks as part of a long-term migratory study. When Paul talked about the ocean in interviews, it was hard not to imagine him as a working scientist. He described it as stranger and more alien than anything found in space, and said more than once that he would walk away from acting entirely to do marine science full-time if he could. That same keen instinct to act rather than just talk showed up away from biology too. After the devastating 2010 earthquake in Haiti, Paul founded Reach Out Worldwide, a disaster relief organization built around a gap he had personally identified. Skilled volunteers willing to help, with no fast way to get them where they were needed. He personally traveled into disaster zones with the organization, to Chile after its own catastrophic earthquake later that year, and eventually to the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. Recall that he was leaving a Reach Out worldwide fundraiser the afternoon he died. But none of this erased what happened in November 2013. Instead, it explains why the people closest to him were left with a problem that had never really come up in the history of a major film franchise before. What do you do when the star of your movie dies with roughly 15% of it still unfilmed? Finishing a film without its star. When Paul Walker died, Furious 7 was still in production, with a significant portion of his scenes unfinished. The studio shut everything down and spent months working privately with Paul's family before deciding how or whether to even proceed at all. The director, James Wan, later said publicly that the story they had originally planned to tell in the movie became irrelevant the moment they lost him. According to him, the only real question left was how to send him off with some dignity. The answer fell largely on two people who had spent their entire lives out of their famous brother's spotlight. Paul's younger brothers, Cody and Caleb Walker, were brought in as physical stand-ins to complete his unfinished scenes, along with a third actor, John Brotherton, whose build and coloring were close enough to work as an additional reference. New Zealand-based Weta Digital, the visual effects studio behind Gollum in The Lord of the Rings and Caesar in the Planet of the Apes franchise, was hired to digitally recreate Walker's face and layer it onto his brother's performances. The process was far from simple. The supervisor of the visual effects later explained that the hardest shots weren't the big action sequences audiences assumed were digitally faked. Those had enough motion and editing to hide imperfections. The genuinely difficult shots were the quiet ones. Walker sitting still, delivering dialogue in close-up, and reacting subtly to another actor in the same frame, where there was nowhere for a flaw to hide. Cody and Caleb were motion-scanned, performing the scenes as their director intended, and Weta reapplied that captured performance onto a digital model of their brother's face. There were roughly 90 of the 350 shots that made up Walker's remaining role. Some of these were pieced together from unused footage and outtakes shot before his death. But the rest required the brothers' work combined with the digital reconstruction. The insurance covering the production's completion reportedly ran into the tens of millions of dollars, an industry record figure at the time. In later interviews, Caleb said the process was unexpectedly emotional in a different way than anyone anticipated. Aside from what it took to finish the film, stepping into his brother's professional world meant learning things about him secondhand, through co-stars and crew that his own family hadn't fully known. Furious 7 was released on April 3, 2015, and went on to gross over $1.5 billion worldwide, the highest total in the franchise's history at that point. Its closing sequence was built specifically as a farewell, rather than a plot beat and closed, with the words, "For Paul," on screen. Audiences who had never cried at an action film found themselves crying at that one. While the franchise gave Paul Walker the farewell that the real world had not had time to prepare, the person who has spent 12 years turning his legacy into something that reaches further than any film ever could is the one whose story belongs at the center of everything he left behind. So what has Meadow Walker done with the inheritance her father left her? And why did Vin Diesel walk her down the aisle? Meadow and the unanswered questions. Meadow Walker was 15 when her father died. She had moved from Hawaii to California only 2 years earlier specifically to be closer to him. And as Paul himself said in interviews, that short window became one of the closest relationships of his adult life. In September 2015, on what would have been his 42nd birthday, Meadow launched the Paul Walker Foundation. In her own words at the time, she said she found herself reconnecting with the things her father had cared about most: the ocean, animal rescue, and a habit of spontaneous generosity toward people he barely knew. The foundation now funds marine science grants and scholarships and partners with organizations including the Monterey Bay Aquarium, continuing the exact kind of ocean conservation work Walker had quietly supported for the better part of a decade before his death. In October 2021, Meadow married actor Louis Thornton Allen in a small beachside ceremony in the Dominican Republic. Her father couldn't walk her down the aisle, so she asked the next closest thing to a father she had, Vin Diesel, her godfather and her father's closest friend and co-star for over a decade. Vin, dressed in a pale blue suit, walked her toward her husband-to-be, while the rest of the Fast and Furious family, including Jordana Brewster, looked on. Meadow still marks her father's birthday publicly every September. On the 10th anniversary of his death, in November 2023, she posted a single line, 10 years without him, and she'd love him forever. But even now, 2 threads from this story still remain open. The confidential 2017 Porsche settlement, built on seatbelt engineering, and Porsche's own claim that the car had been altered, was never made public, and no figure has ever been reported. And the 21 cars sold at Barrett-Jackson in 2020 weren't the full collection. Even though Craig Jackson confirmed Meadow kept vehicles back that she had a connection with, he has never said which ones or where they are now. The warehouse had 30 cars pulled out of it within a day of Paul Walker's death. What's still unaccounted for, more than a decade later, is what happened to everything else. What do you think is really in that sealed settlement? And what happened to the rest of the cars? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.